Hey guys, welcome back to Computer Graphics 2. I hope that you had a wonderful spring break. So this week we are going to pop into photo rescue / restoration. We're going to use Photoshop to take old photos that have been damaged and turn them back to new. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of tools that allow you to do that. You can see them listed here on Moodle. The idea of this assignment came from kind of the early 2000s, right? There was a kind of nonprofit company that came out of Hurricane Katrina in the early 2000s that kind of got it all started. They were called Operation Photo Rescue. They still exist. You can go see their website here. And so the idea was they asked graphic designers across the world to help for free just restore photos that were damaged throughout all of the hurricane, including water damage, right, and being ripped and torn and just aged to the sun and just all of that type of stuff. And that kind of grew into other things we see now, both from like photo restoration Reddits, as well as just, you know, the ability to take and help make the world a better place through the use of Photoshop. So I'm going to go through each of these tools, right, for photo restoration. And then ultimately what you're going to do, right, the pictures I'm using are not the photos you are actually going to use. You're going to go here. You're going to click on this link. This link will take you to a Google Drive folder that has a bunch of photos that we've kind of collaborated and chosen together, so that you can kind of choose which one you feel like you're up to. They all have some type of damage done to it, and they are all possible to rejuvenate and bring back. Ultimately, you're using some kind of mixture of these tools, right? You're probably not going to use just one. You'll probably wind up using a couple different tools to try to bring whichever photo back to life, to try to fix any of those errors, like whether it's splotches, whether it's, you know, tears, whether it's sun damage, whether it's water damage. They all have their own different types of issues, right? As a photo, you can see some are a little bit more complicated depending on like the type of tear that happened. And so really it comes down to you trying to use the tools that we provide to be able to actually restore it. So let's take a look at a couple photos to kind of learn how these tools work, right? So I've got a baby with red demon eyes, pretty common, right? Whenever we see those wonderful red eye effects happening in photos. We're going to talk about how to remove acne, kind of in the ability of kind of using some of these tools, and a little bit of the ethics. And then as well, we're going to remove some of the issues on this road, such as just ill-paved areas, as well as maybe some manhole covers, as well as being able to even like move Big Ben. So let's go ahead and look at the baby first, because I think it's the easiest thing, right? So clearly with red eye, Photoshop has a red eye tool. It's pretty straightforward. You click on it, right? The pupil size you can set. You can check and change the darken amount. But realistically, what you're doing is you're just going to kind of draw a box around the red eye. And sometimes it'll hit it in one full attempt like that. It'll turn it back to normal. Sometimes it might not catch everything, so you might need to go over it a couple times to try to get it, right? But ultimately, it will catch and it'll get rid of the red eye. So easiest tool out of all of them to be able to use. They're all pretty straightforward, but that's probably the most like just obvious answer, right? Very similar to most of our photo apps that we've used ever to remove red eye, either by clicking a single button. Just super straightforward. So let's look at kind of what we can use to remove acne. So obviously, again, this goes into kind of the ethical photoshopping, right, of beauty standards. But what we want to look at is not necessarily the ability of removing acne because of beauty standards, but rather how can we take the same technique to remove the acne, as well as what we saw from some of these photos of being able to restore areas by using surrounding areas to try to fix it, right? So same concept, just using kind of an applicable, easy thing that we can like look at. So let's look at this. We have multiple different ways we can handle this, right? So obviously the biggest thing I'm going to recommend is always to be zoomed in. That's true for everything we do in Photoshop. Zoomed out and working far away does you no justice, so be zoomed in. At this point, obviously, make sure that you hold spacebar. You can move around your image pretty easily when you're zoomed in like that, right? So we'll zoom in, we'll move over there. So let's start off. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose the spot healing brush to kind of start with. So the spot healing brush, you'll notice, has a separate tool also called the healing brush tool. So both act like brushes, right? I want you to see what happens when I use the spot healing brush. So there are a bunch of different options up here. You can see the spot healing brushes, like kind of standard definitions, is content aware. And so what happens with content aware, as I paint around with my brush, it recognizes any of the area that's around that area and is kind of aware of that and tries to merge it into that space, right? So that pimple that was just there, I'll Command Z to undo it, right? If I were to paint around it, just a little swoosh, just a little circle, right? It'll take kind of what's around it and try to mix it. You'll notice sometimes with a little bit of artifacting, and if you do, that's where you need to Command Z to undo it, maybe go smaller, right? Just because it is a brush, that means I can, of course, size it down with my left bracket and right bracket to make it bigger. So if I wanted to get a little area out, right? Sometimes if you look right here, you can kind of see an artifacting where it's like it's trying to merge and it's not really blending as well. So again, you can kind of play with the size of the brush and see how well it blends back and forth. So spot healing brush, right? The spot healing brush pretty much does most of the work. The healing brush is similar. The issue with it is if I try to click right now, right, you'll notice that option click to define a source point to be used to repair the image pops up as an error. And so basically this and the clone stamp have a similar type idea. So with the healing brush, so not the spot healing brush, but with the healing brush and with the clone stamp, we have to define what we're replacing it with, right? So the spot healing brush kind of use content aware to tell it what's around here. It's going to fill it in with a space. With the healing brush and the clone stamp tool, we have to hold option. Notice that my mouse turns into kind of like a crosshair section mouse now. And so I need to tell it, where am I sourcing from? Imagine you're painting something, and so you need to be able to tell it, cool, what paint am I using, right? So for this pimple, I want to use something that's within the same area. I don't want this bright skin that's over here. I don't want the lips, right? So I need something that's kind of similar in tone. So I might choose from over here. I'm going to click and let go with my mouse. I'm still holding Alt, right? And now if I go over here, notice that the pixels that are in my mouse, right, are that little area of the skin that I had chosen, right? Which means that if I had Alt clicked over here, notice that the same color is of the lips, right? So we want to choose to sample from the same area we're kind of pulling from. So maybe I'll go down a little bit down here because this is where the shadow's pulling, and then I will kind of do a small swivel. Notice that a lot of the times I keep mentioning with painting or with just any of these tools, I'm going to do very small, subtle areas. I'm not doing a big ol' swoosh, right? The big ol' swoosh a lot of the times with the mouse and any type of brush for restoration is going to give it a lot of artifacting. And when I say artifacting, I'm really talking about it kind of pixelating and it looking unnatural, right? The idea of photo restoration and photo rescue is really to make it look as natural and as real as possible. We're trying to make it look as if it was never damaged, right? So let's go down again. So we've got the patch tool, right? The patch tool and the content aware move tool are two newer tools, at least within the past 5 to 7 years of Photoshop. And so I want you to see kind of what they're doing. So the patch tool, right? Kind of sounds like what it's going to be, right? We're replacing a selected area with pixels from another part of the image. So it's another way we can kind of handle. You can kind of see the animation that's in the preview right there. So I'm going to draw out my little patch, right? So I'm going to do it around this pimple area. And so I've got my selection. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it. And let's say that I moved it up here, right? Once I click and let go, it's going to replace that selected area with whatever I moved it to, right? So again, if I moved this over, we would see that it would replace it with the lips and it would try to kind of like merge it with the skin tone, which looks creepy as heck, but also kind of has cool effects if you're trying to get a surrealistic painting. If you're trying to apply this technique to make something kind of a collage or something like that. For photo restoration, go with similar skin tone, go with similar things, go with areas directly around it. But but you can kind of see it replaces it pretty nicely. Command D to deselect. It does it really, really smoothly. Let's look at the content aware move tool, right? So it's kind of similar, right? I'm going to draw around my little area, right? It will make a selection. When I click and drag it around, I want you to see what's happening, right? So it doesn't replace it. It literally moves it, right? So if I hit enter, it moved that pimple over to the left, right? Which Big Ben as a perfect example, right? If I wanted to take this picture and alter it and make it look like Big Ben was to the left, this is where I could come in here, kind of come in right above the tree line, find every little bit of Big Ben right there along with the sky. And then if I wanted, I could be like, all right, cool, Big Ben is going to be over here, and I could hit enter and try to make it look as if it's going to move over here, right? Obviously, again, Command D to deselect. If we look at it, leaves some scarring, some artifacting, and so you'd have to clean this up by using other tools. But this is one of those cool things that we can use. I would say that the content aware move tool is something that's kind of cool if you want to manipulate and kind of create other altered effects. So something that maybe works for photo restoration, but not perfectly. Again, I think the patch tool, the healing brush, the spot healing brush are the better tools to really try to use for a lot of photo restoration, but this is kind of a similar type tool. So I just want to make sure you at least have that. So let's go back to the girl. I'm going to Command D to deselect. So we already talked about the red eye tool. So let's bounce back to here, right? So we have two types of stamps, right? We have clone stamp and we have pattern stamp. Clone stamp sounds kind of similar to what it's going to sound like, right? It's cloning. So it works kind of like I said, similar. It works similar to the healing brush tool where I need to alt click to be able to choose a source that it's pulling from. So if I, for instance, choose, let's say I'm going to replace this pimple. If I want to choose and replace it with this skin tone, I'll alt click and then I can paint away. Notice that that little crosshair to the left moves along, and so this is exactly what I'm painting with, which means if I keep painting to the right, notice it's going to paint whatever it follows along with, right? I want you to note that the clone stamp literally clones, right? So if I hold Alt, click, and then paint around, it takes whatever's here and it clones it, which means if I were to clone, for instance, her lips, I could literally clone her lips wherever I wanted it to be elsewhere, and she could have multiple lips, right? So unlike with the healing brush, right, which basically took areas and kind of merged it and blended it together with what you were using to paint, this literally clones whatever you choose as your source. So again, a really cool effect, I think, for later on projects where you're trying to kind of make different effects of, surrealistic type paintings or surrealistic type photos. I think that this comes off as a really great tool. The clone stamp tool works really well for that, but for blending, it may not so, right? But if you're trying to steal something that's exactly the same, then and you've got a defined source, so maybe a perfect example of that, right? If you know that you have, this black area on this stripe of this flag behind them, right? We know that this is exactly the same as here, so we can use that to make sure that it's bridged over across this tear that's here, right? Probably not the best thing to use across skin because the shading that is happening between the shadows and the highlights of his forehead probably not going to be the same, right? So that would be something more for the blending options of the healing brush or the spot healing brush, okay? Let's look at our final tool, which doesn't really play into for this project, but again, I think that it's valuable to look at all of the tools. So the pattern stamp tool, right? If we look at our options bar, we can see that a pattern is already defined. We can choose it as trees, we can choose it as grass, we can choose it as water. We can create new patterns and add those patterns. This is really good. So as a stamp, that means that when I click and paint with it, it's going to just stamp with whatever that pattern is pulling from, right? So if it has grass or if it's leaves, it's going to paint with that pattern. This potentially could be something that could be cool if you are trying to maybe paint over the lips only, right? And you were wanting like the lips to have the pattern of, this. it might work. Let's say, for instance, I did a new layer and I painted, let's say I did that right here, and I like painted it with the pattern of this grass, and then I like blended that pattern down. Let me drop the opacity and like blend it down maybe with something, right? I could have it kind of blending with the lips of the natural thing. It's an okay tool. It's not something that I typically use in my everyday. It's not something for this project, but again, something that I think that you should at least know exists. The clone stamp is really more of a tool to use for healing and being able to restore a photo in general. So those are our photo restoration tools. I think that they all have their own merits. I think that they all have their own possibilities. Finding the right balance between all of them is kind of going to be where you're going to have to go with this project, right? So there's not one perfect tool for every photo. You have to kind of use the mix match of different tools. And as I've always said since day one, right? If something doesn't work, let's say for instance you use the patch tool and you're like, cool, I'll move this over. Oh, I need to be on my background layer. Let me delete this layer so I can just get rid of the weird lips. There we go. Let's say that I move this and it like just it leaves weird scarring, or it leaves weird, like it just doesn't look natural. Command Z in that moment and look at it, right? Constantly be aware of what your photo is looking like when you make an edit like that. Zoom out, see what it looks like. It's okay. Note that these are all destructive edits. Her lips are now like that. I can go back and I can Command Z to keep going back until I undid those lips. But ultimately, if you do something like that and it's later down the road, you probably are going to have to redo that. You're going to have to somehow blend that back into normal. So just make sure that you go and kind of think of what you're ultimately doing. Also, I just started to move my area, which of course means I just cut out a chunk of her face. So again, be aware of which tools you're on. Be aware of what you're trying to do. Be aware of using different tools. That's the biggest thing I can recommend for all of these. Well, not use the pattern. So if you have questions, as always, just make sure that you ask. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.